Brakey.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. I move that this body accept the ought not to pass report.
The Senator from Androscoggin, Senator Brakey, moves the minority ought not to pass report be accepted in non-concurrence. Chair recognizes the Senator from Cumberland, Senator Alfond.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I request a roll call.
The Senator from Cumberland, Senator Alfond, has requested a roll call. In order for the Chair to order a roll call, it must have the express desire of 1/5 of the members present. All those in favor of a roll call, please indicate electronically. Obviously, more than 1/5 of the members present are in favor of a roll call. A roll call has been ordered. The pending question before the Senate is acceptance of the Chair recognizes the Senator from Cumberland, Senator Haskell.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and ladies and gentlemen of the Senate. I am rising to oppose the current motion of ought not to pass, and I'm going to ask you if you would please vote against it. I think that the importance of vaccines to our general public health is a matter of a lot of interest and concern for us. On the committee, there was also a lot of conversation regarding the types of oppositions that people had to immunizations, and those oppositions for philosophical reasons. And the committee did, at great length, debate this issue, but it was clear that there are a number of our schools at which, while the overall school rate was acceptable, there are outliers. There are numbers of our schools where the vaccination rates have taken a very significant dip, and it's been of concern to those schools and to the parents of the kids who are in those schools. Vaccinations are a public health issue. We do understand that there are people who would like to, for philosophical reasons, opt out of vaccinations. And the committee respected that. The amendment that is the Amendment A, Committee Amendment A here in the bill, says that a parent seeking a philosophical exemption must include a statement with written documentation signed by a healthcare practitioner that's authorized to prescribe and administer immunizations, verifying that that practitioner has reviewed with the parent information about the risks and benefits of immunization consistent with CDC information. It doesn't prescribe what that provider has to say. It doesn't indicate that the parent has to agree or that they have to have a discussion, simply that they have seen a healthcare practitioner, and that can be anybody who is able to prescribe or able to do a vaccination. So that's a wide, broad number of health providers. And it's a very straightforward method by which parents can become engaged and informed without removing that philosophical exemption. And I think that was a very carefully crafted compromise, and I would urge you to vote against the ought not to pass report. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the Senator from Androscoggin, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to support the ought not to pass report on LD 471. Of all the legislation we've heard public testimony on in the Health and Human Services Committee this session, aside from the budget itself, this bill had by far the longest public hearing we experienced. We heard hours of testimony by staunch opponents of this bill, as well as staunch proponents. We heard from medical professionals on both sides of this issue. We even heard from Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who came to Maine specifically to testify on his concerns about this legislation. In all that testimony, there was much disagreement on the extent to which there are potential negative health consequences for some people as a result of certain vaccinations. But every medical professional and every person there seemed to agree that just like every medicine or pharmaceutical, there are some potential negative health side effects for some people. The extent to which the extent of those side effects was a matter for debate, but everyone agreed that some of those did in fact exist. In fact, there is a federal program, the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, specifically set aside for individuals with severe negative outcomes from vaccines they received. Now, one of the repeated refrains we heard from opponents of this bill was, quote, "Where there is risk, there must be choice," end quote. This bill would put up barriers to the free choice of parents to make the best decisions they can for their children, and I am uncomfortable supporting that. During his testimony before our committee, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. highlighted an ongoing corruption scandal taking place right now at the federal CDC around the withholding of risk information from the public. There are concerns about the integrity of the approval process for these products of these pharmaceutical corporations. Public hearings are in fact currently scheduled for later this year around this ongoing scandal. Now, myself personally, I believe that on the net whole, vaccines have had a tremendous benefit for people. But we must also acknowledge that there are some problems with the current structure of the industry around vaccines. Vaccines are one of the few products that have a particular designation from the federal government. They are considered, quote, unavoidably unsafe. What this essentially means is that the federal government has decided that there is an inherent danger to some for vaccines, but those dangers are unavoidable. This gives the pharmaceutical companies that produce these vaccines complete immunity from all legal liability in the event of negative health outcomes. Now think about that for a moment. If we as individuals were buying a car and we had two choices, both cars were identical in every way except for one major difference. The first car was manufactured by a company with full legal liability in the event that their product malfunctioned and injured you. And the second car was manufactured by a company that had no liability. If that car malfunctioned, if the brakes suddenly gave out, that company would not be on the hook for any damages. Let us ask ourselves, which car would I buy? Would it not be obvious that the company with full liability has much more reason to take extra precaution to ensure the safety of their product? Furthermore, the premise for this bill was based on data that suggested Maine's unvaccinated rate was particularly high and risked us dropping below what's considered herd immunity levels. However, as we worked through this bill, it was found that the data was wrong. In fact, that data had to be revised during the process of that this bill was being considered. It turns out that the statewide vaccination rates are significantly higher than what was initially suggested by the data, and we are well over the herd immunity thresholds. I have some of this data here, but I'm not going to go over it unless anyone wanted me to. But I think what this really points to is that the system, as we have it, is currently working. We're well over the herd immunity thresholds, and why would we want to fix something that isn't broken and seems to be working? And I will say, just as a last point, on the issue around the structure of the vaccine industry and the complete immunity from all legal liability for the manufacturers, I mean, the Health and Human Services Committee unanimously drafted a letter to encourage the federal government to look at changing this structure. Everyone on the committee recognized that is potentially a real problem. I just say, while that problem exists, I'm not comfortable putting this barrier up to parental choice. So thank you very much, Mr. President.
The pending question before the Senate is acceptance of the minority ought not to pass report. If you're in favor, you'll be voting yes. If you're opposed, you'll be voting no. Is the Senate ready for the question? The doorkeeper will secure the chamber. The Secretary will open the vote. Chair is in error. Chair recognizes the Senator from Lincoln, Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just wanted to speak briefly on this matter, point out that someone speaking with their doctor, not having to get permission from the doctor, but merely speak with them, is not a profound barrier. In fact, it's good advice. The choice is still the person's. That choice is not being taken away from them. Where there is risk, there is still choice. So I think that this is a very reasonable measure. It is not placing a burden on people who want to make that choice for themselves, whichever way. It does help ensure that they have information from a health professional. Of course, they're welcome to information from whatever other sources they want, and they're welcome to make their own decisions still. That's not changed by this bill. Thank you.
Is the Senator ready? Chair recognizes the Senator from Cumberland, Senator Haskell.
Thank you very much, Mr. President and ladies and gentlemen. First, I do apologize for my misstatement earlier, Mr. President. But since we have now spoken regarding the immunization rates, I would just point out to you that in 2013, an estimated 68% of Maine children from 19 months to 35 months were up to date on the full recommended series. That's 68%. That's the seventh lowest in the country, compared with 73% in 2012. Maine's immunization rates for kindergartners have increased in each of the past several years, resulting in, that's the exemption rates, resulting in Maine having the fifth highest rate of immunization exemptions in the United States. So the trend in both of those is not moving in the right direction, and I believe that it is time for us to very cautiously and very carefully move forward with this bill. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the Senator from Androscoggin, Senator Brakey.
Thank you, Mr. President. I apologize for rising a second time. I will be very brief. The data we have on compilation of kindergarten vaccination rates and exemptions as reported by the CDC for kindergartners in 2014-2015, polio vaccine, 95.62%, DTaP vaccine, 95.54%, MMR vaccine, 92.14%, varicella vaccine, 95.71%. These are well over the herd immunity thresholds we heard from in the committee, and the philosophical exemption is only 3.69%. And that's the philosophical exemption includes anyone using the philosophical exemption for any individual vaccine. So you could be receiving all the vaccines except for one, and you would be in that 3.69%. Thank you very much.
Pending question that before the Senate is acceptance of the minority ought not to pass report. If you're in favor of accepting that report, you'll be voting yes. If you're opposed, you'll be voting no. Is the Senate ready for the question? The doorkeeper will secure the chamber. The Secretary will open the vote. Have all now voted? Secretary will close the vote and run the total. Chair will announce the vote. 13 senators having voted in the affirmative and 22 senators having voted in the negative. The motion to accept the minority report fails. Is it now the pleasure of the Senate that the majority ought to pass as amended report be accepted in concurrence? It's a vote. First reading of printed bill.
House Paper 310, LD 471.
Chair understands the Senator from Cumberland, Senator Haskell, moves the reading be dispensed with. The Secretary will read Committee Amendment A.
Committee Amendment A is the volume
Chair
number of
understands the Senator from Kennebec,
H426.
Senator McCormick, moves the reading of Committee Amendment A be dispensed with. Is it now the pleasure of the Senate to adopt Committee Amendment A? It's a vote. Is it now the pleasure of the Senate that the rules be suspended, give this bill its second reading, at this time by title only? It's a vote.
An act to improve childhood vaccination rates in Maine.
Is it the pleasure of the Senate that this bill be passed to be engrossed in concurrence? It's a vote.
Item 5